So, hello and welcome to Bad Art, a podcast about the politics of art in the 21st century. Today, Marielle and I are revisiting Style Wars, the classic documentary about New York City graffiti in the early 1980s. Graffiti in the 1980s was pervasive in New York, particularly on the subway trains, which were covered with vivid, colorful graffiti pieces. Many urban residents and city authorities viewed graffiti as a scourge, which was harming the city, and they sought often drastic means to get graffiti under control. At the same time, this is a crucial moment in the development of the art form, which today is much more widely accepted and often embraced or encouraged by municipal leaders. We wanted to look back at the film, think about what's changed, and reflect on what Style Wars can tell us about art and politics, both in 1982 and today. So, welcome. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock. I'm here with my co-host.
I'm Mariel Grushko. Happy to be with you today.
Yeah, and you're listening to Bad Art. So, Style Wars.
Yeah. So, Colin, it was your idea for us to watch Style Wars and do this look back. I had never heard of Style Wars before you brought it to my attention. Fun fact of behind the episode, I initially watched the wrong early 80s movie about graffiti and hip hop culture in New York. If you're looking for a compliment to Style Wars, I can highly recommend Wild Style. It's a lot of fun to watch.
So, you watched two movies, two great movies.
I, you know, thankfully, I guess so it was like with Wild Style, I watched like a little, like maybe the first half to two-thirds of it.
Okay.
And then I was like, okay, I'm sleepy. I'm going to continue this tomorrow. And then I woke up the next morning. I was like, that's not the movie I was supposed to watch.
My recall on, I haven't seen it in a long time. My recall on Wild Style is that one, is a fiction, two, it's not got much of a plot,
Mhm.
and three, it's an interesting showcase for a number of hip hop pioneers who are like, hey, why don't you put me on a movie?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's telling that like I turned it on and within just like the opening sequence, John, who was like off doing something else, but in the same room, saw this opening sequence and was like, what is this? This is awesome.
And it
Uh,
was the wrong movie. Oh
and it was
no.
the wrong movie, but we were both like riveted, right? Yes, so I guess what they did for Wild Style is they loosely constructed a scenario that the film would be. And then, yeah, they were like, here's a scene. Now, like, improvise what you would do inside that scenario, which I think Christopher Guest's group of actors worked this way too. But it's probably the kind of thing that works better if you are a trained director working with trained actors. I can't imagine just being like an artist and then it's okay, now play a character based on yourself on camera in like some sort of weird scenario. And so I looked at some reviews afterward, and the reviews at the time said the film never quite rises to the level
Hmm.
of the vibrancy of what it's depicting, which is true. But at the same time, it's this really wonderful showcase for all of these amazing creative pioneers. And then it's to sort of juxtapose it with Style Wars, which in some ways does, despite the more static format of a documentary, I think in some ways does a more effective job conveying the vibrancy of the scene. But I don't know, they were both good. It was fun to they were released, I believe, the same year. So,
Or close to it. I think Wild Style may have been 82 and Style Wars may have been 83, but they were both filmed in 82. So
but the circumstances of their production at least were like
yeah.
very close together in time.
Yeah. This is an interesting thing, like maybe we'll talk about and we should maybe jump in. But Style Wars is dramatic and it's one of the things they talk about in some of the interviews. It opens with Wagner, or not Wagner, but imitation Wagner, and one of the producers, Tony Silver, describes it as an opera, that it's this
No
dramatic
way.
story that he's creating. And I think that's,
Are we recording? Because I want to hear about this. Like, if I were listening to this episode, I'd want to hear about it.
yeah, we are recording. I think maybe we should take this in at some point. So yeah, so like he describes it as an opera and it's got characters and villains and a dramatic arc which he's thinking about and making the documentary. And I do think that's one of the reasons that it resonates, is that the subject matter is so much bigger than its content because of the dramatic heft that it has for its protagonists.
Yes, that's so interesting to think about it as an operatic structure because the character that I kept thinking about after I had turned off the documentary was he's interviewed always in his kitchen with his mother.
Scheme.
Scheme.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just kept thinking about the rapport between Scheme and his mom. And the way that those interviews, which are like very sweet and lighthearted in a way, they're used to kind of punctuate and provide some comic relief inside the documentary. So now I'm thinking of Scheme and his mom as the comedic relief characters in an opera. And so they're sort of, they run onto stage and maybe they chase each other and do like this little singing back and forth, and then they run off again. And when they come back, you're like, hooray, here they are again, which is how I came to feel about Scheme and his mom.
They're a great character couple. She rolls her eyes and you can like hear them roll. She's just her disbelief at what her son is saying is just so marvelously comical. And it's interesting, like they did a 40 years later recently and had them both,
Oh, wow.
show up on stage and talk about the movie, and apparently they're still exactly the same.
That is delightful. I really love the layers of their relationship that you get throughout the film.
Yeah.
So, first of all, so yes, you can hear her roll her eyes. And after many such scenes of Scheme says something and his mom rolls her eyes, finally, Scheme says something that is so outrageous that his mother turns to the cameraman and she says, "You see what I have to put up with?"
Now that you've heard that, you understand what I'm saying to you when I say that I don't understand him. He's out there to bomb, destroy all lines. What have the lines ever done to him? What have the lines ever done to him?
75 cents.
When do you pay 75 cents?
Never, but...
Well, so I don't even know what you're talking about.
So that's one thing. But then also the heartwarming scene toward the end of the film where, Scheme is describing going out at 2 a.m. to write. And he says, well, of course I'm going to tell my mother about it. She needs to know where I am. And
Yeah.
you feel the love that they still have for each other, even though, you see what he
It
has.
is very sweet. Yeah.
Yes.
So let's give this some structure.
Yes.
Um,
So, Colin, why don't you tell us a little bit about what it is about this film that is so special to you and why you wanted to revisit it for this episode?
yeah, great. So Style Wars is a classic hip hop documentary. It tackles New York City in 1982 when early graffiti was perhaps at its peak. And because of the documentary, like the documentary is directly responsible for hip hop culture spreading around the globe. So one of the ways that graffiti was discovered in Paris and London and Brazil and South Africa was that people would watch this documentary and say, "Oh, that looks cool. I'm going to go out and try that here." So it was an educational document about what graffiti was that helped to spread the art form. And it's also just a really great documentary. The filmmakers had incredible access. So the filmmakers are Tony Silver and Henry Chalfant. And Chalfant, he had a background with photography. So for like several years, he'd been going out and photographing the trains. So New York City subway trains at this time, many of you have probably seen images of this were just covered with graffiti, big, colorful mural style pieces. And so Chalfant was going out and photographing the trains and making photographic scenes out of them, like splicing together the photographs. And at some point, the graffiti artists saw him doing this and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And they began building a relationship where they would come to his apartment and look at the photos of the trains that he had, be excited to see the photos of the graffiti that they had made. And they would start calling him and saying, "Hey, Henry, we're going to be here at, this time tomorrow. Come see this train roll by." So he had this like deep relationship with the graffiti artist starting, I think, in 1978. And so by the time they decided to make this film, he had this kind of access. And, one of the things that stands out in the film, the graffiti artists are all, I mean, they're all high school aged, young kids. And they're so excited to show off to the filmmakers what it is that they're doing and to explain their different art processes and where they go and what this means to them. And they're so comfortable talking to them because they have this deep rapport.
So, okay, I have two thoughts.
Yeah.
First thought is, I guess it's a question. There are a number of scenes in the documentary where the graffiti writers are flipping through photo books
Hmm.
as they speak on camera. And the photos are they're arranged as horizontal rows of different subway cars, right?
Yeah.
So row one is like one subway train that's just car after car after car, and you see the grammar of the graffiti across the whole car. Then there's like some negative space in black, and then there will be like another photo strip showing another subway train and another. So if I'm understanding you correctly, those are Chalfant's photographs that they're
Yeah.
looking at. Oh, that's so cool. I did not put that together while I was watching it.
It's not obvious from the film. I think you have to read some of the interviews with Chalfant to get that info.
Great. That's great. And yeah, to your second point about the youth of the figures in the documentary and their comfort levels with being filmed, there's this innocence and sweetness
Yeah.
to their rapport with the camera and with the director, right? You can see, I don't know that vulnerability is the right word. I would go with sweetness, that they're
Yeah.
just very comfortably themselves, even when they're showing off in the loud, aggressive ways that teenage boys will always tend to do.
Yeah.
You can tell that they know that it's a performance that they're putting on for someone that they consider a friend. It's
Yeah.
very,
Yeah, it's really cool in that way. Another thing which we should say about the importance of this film is just that it comes at a key moment in time. So, on the one hand, the development of graffiti mural styles is really peaking in New York. On the other hand, the city administration is working to contain graffiti. Like it views graffiti as a scourge which is messing up the city. And so they're trying to stop graffiti from being painted on the subway. And shortly after this film, they basically succeed. So within a few years, the graffiti that had covered New York City train cars is basically gone. And if you read interviews about this film, there are graffiti artists who believe that if the film hadn't been made, graffiti would have stopped because there'd have been like a disappearance and no record. And it's the distribution of this film that made graffiti into an international art form. The other interesting thing which is happening at this time is that some of the artists being profiled are beginning to get gallery shows. So they're moving from being street kids who are doing graffiti art to gallery artists who are getting, paid significant amounts of money for graffiti art. So you also see the beginning of graffiti respectability in this film. So I think that moment of time is really fascinating. And it's purely a coincidence that this is what the film catches, but it's also a really interesting time period to observe.
for sure. Okay, so what should we dive into first?
So we should maybe give some background just on what graffiti is doing in New York at this time. Like, where did graffiti come from? What is the film capturing?
Yeah.
Most conversations and this film situate the origin of graffiti in the Bronx. As a Philadelphian, I have to say that's not accurate. Um,
Uh-oh.
nah, Cornbread in Philadelphia was doing it in 1965, and it really picks up in the Bronx in 1972. So, like the writing your name everywhere and getting fame for writing your name everywhere as the origin of this type of graffiti. But regardless, it developed heavily in the Bronx. There's sites throughout the Bronx that are shown in the film, including train yards, what's called the writer's bench. So the Bronx is a hub of the development of graffiti and of hip hop culture
Would
more
you
broadly.
would you say that would it be accurate to say that although the first graffiti art was created in 1965 in Philly, it was in the Bronx where it first grew into a creative scene with multiple participants feeding off of one another's creativity?
Um, so I do
Don't
think like
know.
it rose to a certain level of importance in the Bronx, But before it was big, I have some quotes from before it was big, writers of the New York Times coming down to Philly and being like, holy cow, there's graffiti everywhere. I mean, they didn't like it, but they were blown away by how much. And I had a figure somewhere like there was something like 10,000 graffiti writers active in Philadelphia in 1970. Like that's just
Wow.
like a crazy number.
That is a crazy
So,
number.
so
That
there
that
were big
actually
scenes in both cities.
So that actually is a question that I had. It wasn't entirely clear to me from the documentary how many graffiti writers were active, circa 1982 when this was made. Because, we have a couple of scenes where they're at the bench at Grand Concourse. And so you can tell, if they can summon this many people to Grand Concourse to talk about Cap and how he's insulted them, which we'll get into later, I'm sure, then clearly that is but the tip of the iceberg of active graffiti writers. But I was curious whether we have any numbers on, how prevalent was this?
That's a great question. So just to give some like on the writers bench at the Grand Concourse, this is a subway station where the graffiti writers would gather to share designs, share ideas with one another, network, make plans to go out together to hit a particular train or a particular place. And in the scene, you see like something like 40, I would say, writers crowded into this small area in the subway, which is, I mean, a significant number of kids all gathered together for a single purpose. But obviously there are more. And you look at the visuals, I mean, there are hundreds of trains covered with hundreds of pieces of graffiti. So there have to be hundreds, if not thousands, of writers active, a major part of a certain subset of youth culture in New York at that time.
Yeah.
So, the Bronx. What's going on in the Bronx? So, the Bronx in the 1970s is pretty devastated. New York had its bankruptcy scare in the mid 70s when President Ford famously said, well, he didn't actually say this, but the headline said Ford to city drop dead because the city had a bankruptcy crisis and Ford said, we're not going to bail you out. And as a result, the city administration was forced to implement a lot of austerity policies. So they laid off a bunch of city workers. They cut funding for a bunch of city programs. They eliminated fire stations and public services and things like that. And one of the things that began happening in this time is that you have what's called the burning of the Bronx, which is landlords would set their properties on fire to collect insurance money because they weren't getting any rent, or not getting enough rent out of the property. And thousands of buildings in the Bronx were burned down at this time. There's a famous scene, which I'm going to show you, which is the 1977 World Series. And the Bronx is burning in the background. So here's the commentary.
That is a live picture, and obviously a major fire in a large building in the South Bronx region of New York City. That's a live picture, and obviously the fire department in the Bronx have their problem. My goodness, that's a huge blaze.
That's the very area where President Carter trod just a few days ago.
With one out now, 2-0.
I just love that they just like go back into talking about baseball. But
I do too. I love the casualness. They're just like, oh yeah, that's a huge blaze. Okay, anyway.
okay, anyway. But the desolation of the Bronx is an important background for the rise of hip hop because hip hop is often described as an art form or a series of art forms that manages to make something out of nothing. So breakdancing, all you need really is a cardboard piece of cardboard to do your thing on. If you're rapping, you just need a microphone. If you're emceeing, you don't need instruments, right? The whole thing is you just need records and an amplifier. So you don't need the whole band to put together. And graffitiing obviously is done on top of the desecrated city.
Huh. I'm thinking about the sort of concurrent rise of hip hop and punk cultures.
Mm.
And that, there's some similarities, right, in terms of making do with kind of the refuse that the rest of society doesn't find value in. But punk is about doing things even if you do them really badly,
Right.
right? You play your instrument badly, and that's fine. You sing badly, and that's fine. Whereas hip hop is about the refinement of a particular aesthetic in those conditions of adversity.
Yeah, that is interesting. That's definitely true. And graffiti artists will tell you, and they tell you repeatedly throughout the film, we're actually making this urban decay beautiful, right? Now the administrators, their parents don't agree, but from the perspective of the artists, they're improving their desolate environment.
Right. From their perspective, they are making the city that they wish to see.
Yeah.
There's this really lovely scene in Style Wars where they talk about going to the clean subway car and just decorating the whole thing all in one go, right? And
Yeah.
you can see how thrilled they are to have what they think of as a blank slate for their artwork.
Yeah. Yeah. Go
Wait,
ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, okay, just thinking about the conditions of austerity in New York in the 70s. Style Wars opens with a conversation about who really runs the subway,
Mm.
who really
Yeah.
runs the MTA. And the claim that the graffiti writers are making is they run it, right? They're the ones in charge. And I walked away from the film thinking, I think they are right because the impression that you get from the interviews with the mayor, with the head of the MTA, is that they are trying to wrestle control back.
Yeah.
These are not people imposing a control that they already have. These are people frantically trying to claw back what they consider to be theirs. And so I guess now I'm just thinking about that idea of the teens from the Bronx running the subway. What does that tell us about how New Yorkers would have experienced austerity in the 1970s, right? When I think about more recent episodes of austerity after the 2008 financial crisis, I remember a feeling of no one who is supposed to be in charge has any actual authority around here, and we just have to do our best with what we have. But I never would have expected 16-year-olds to be the ones making that happen.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, the other New Yorkers pretty clearly, as is documented in the film, are experiencing like a loss of control and a loss of order. And this doesn't come out in the film, but if you look at like analyses of graffiti elsewhere, sometimes it's described as an assertion of presence. So people who are socially excluded are able to prove that they're a present part of your social fabric by imprinting their presence in public space. And certainly one thing that this graffiti accomplishes is you can't ignore the kids in the Bronx who are otherwise forgotten about and thrown away. Now, the response is hostile, right? But that they are saying, we're here and we have just as much a right to the city as anyone else.
Right.
I have an interesting map which I wanted to share with you, and we'll put this in the show notes. But this is from a book called Nonstop Metropolis, New York City Atlas by Joshua Jelly Shapiro and Rebecca Solnit. And this is a map of the burning of the Bronx and the rise of hip hop overlapped on top of one another. So if you look, like you can see the the red on the map highlights where the Bronx has burned, and the dark red areas are like 90% burned out.
Wow.
And the numbers, the figures over top are the seminal events in the birth of hip hop. So the first hip hop party thrown in an abandoned lot, right? The rise of graffiti, the first wild style. These sorts of things are here. The writer's bench that we mentioned earlier is here in the map. So it's a really interesting document. If you can see it, I just think is really interesting that they also chose to include that the young lords seized an X-ray truck. The young lord seized an X-ray truck and provided free medical care to the community also in this space. So you have a radical political background
Right.
and the rise of hip hop happening at the same time in this urban environment.
That's so interesting. And that's I would imagine that they're building on the work that the Black Panthers did with free medical care
Yeah. I mean,
a decade
from what I
earlier.
know of the Young Lords, they were really big on the free medical care. So they took over, I think, an abandoned hospital at a later point and turned it into a community clinic. But they learned from the Black Panthers and then were were subject to some of the same repression.
Right.
But yeah,
Just to go back to the map for a moment,
yeah,
it is definitely striking to see this correlation between what percentage of an area was burned and its role in this early history of hip hop.
yeah,
Because for the most part, the little numbered dots are really placed in the areas where there is a larger concentration of burned areas.
yeah. And it really does make it clear how closely interrelated these two phenomenon were.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. And so then, of course, you start to wonder when you look at a map like this, in the sense that you ask yourself, is it the physical material conditions of urban abandonment, or is it the spiritual harm of urban abandonment that gave birth to this culture?
Well, I mean, there's a tradition in Black studies that situates creativity as a response to segregation and abandonment. So how can we make this oppressive situation into something that works for us? And so there's a lot of creativity to imagine social possibility, support, thriving
Mhm.
within these abandoned contexts that more comfortable people may not have to reach for in the same way. So I mean that's one maybe way of taking it. That it does take into account like the racial history of the U.S.
Yeah. I think it's really striking that the youth who are interviewed for the documentary don't really talk about abandonment or segregation. And they have this optimism about what they're doing. And mainly what you feel from them is just a sense of raw, unfettered creativity and curiosity, coupled with this, desire to assert their own presence. But I did find it really striking that you don't really hear them reflecting on abandonment or exclusion or being disadvantaged. And, it may be as simple as they're really young and they feel these things, but wouldn't even think to articulate them on camera because it's so much the water in which they were swimming. But I did find it interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the only place, well, you see it, it's shown some in the footage of the documentary. There is footage of burned out neighborhoods and some of the music, of course, which is, I mean, phenomenal soundtrack
Oh yeah.
of early hip hop. It's just incredible. But some of the music has, I think it's Grandmaster Flash, Don't Push Me, I'm Close to the Edge, that is talking about the conditions of the Bronx at that time. Or, some of the graffiti says, all I see is crime in the city. Like, so there is comment on the situation in the art, but you're right, not in the interviews, which I think is pretty interesting.
And I think that's one of, thinking about our response to this film as anthropologists, I think that that's that juxtaposition is one of the things that makes this film feel quite ethnographic,
Hmm.
is that you have the perspective of the artists themselves with all of the limitations and specificity that any one perspective entails. And then you get this richly layered artifact in the film that communicates so much more of what hip hop culture was through the choice of music, through the choice of visuals to accompany the words that the interviewees are speaking.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great example of ethnographic documentary. And I mean, if you talk about anthropologists doing, long-term deep hanging out as a research method, the fact that Chalfant had 3 years before making this movie of getting to know the people and learning the situation is part of what makes it so rich.
Hmm. Absolutely.
I mean, just thinking back about what you're saying about the hopefulness, I also think it's part of what makes this an exciting documentary is that it's not poverty porn, right? It's showing the excitement and creativity and vitality of these youth, where you can read that the background is disadvantaged, but it's not presented as this is something holding them back.
Right. And I mean, the feeling that you get is that they go where they want to.
Yeah,
They tag what they want to tag, right? It is this experience that they have of utter freedom when they're writing,
yeah.
that they're attempting to communicate through how they speak in their interviews. And for me, it was quite effective. Like I could picture myself there. I could imagine what they would feel when they go out and make art.
Speaking of total freedom, in one of the interviews I read while getting ready for this, there's a scene in the movie where three graffiti writers go down into an abandoned subway station that has become a graffiti writing hotspot. And they show off how the walls are just covered with several generations of graffiti. And they're so excited that they can go down into this abandoned space and that it's such a rich spot for their culture. But the background to that scene is that the filmmakers had to get permission from the MTA to go down.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And they had to get the MTA to promise not to arrest the kids when they went down. So they got this permission, and as part of the permission, two MTA workers went along. And they got to the subway hatch, and there was a big padlock on it. And the MTA workers were like, "We don't have the key, so sorry, guys." And one of the graffiti writers, this guy is the Wiz, pulls a key out of his pocket, unlocks the subway, and leads them in.
So back to the question of who runs the
Who
subway
runs the city? Yeah.
is the Wiz runs it. Yeah.
So some of the history we get in presented in the film, so we're getting into the film now, is that coming out of the Bronx, one of the first things you see is graffiti writers begin to go all city. So it begins with someone named Taki 183 who just writes the word Taki 183 everywhere and on all of the trains. And what going all city means is that you have your name on every train line in the city. And that acquires a certain amount of fame and respect. So Taki 183 is the first to do this. Then there are several others. And it's pretty interesting watching graffiti writers tell you this history because they all know it. Here's who was first. Here's who was second. Here are some of the people who are doing it. And then as they were doing it, they began to get more artful. So they designed new arrows, and then they began arting up the letters. And then we got to where we are today with these big murals that are often, the point isn't for them to be read by passerby, but for showing off to one another that you can do this with your name. So that kind of development leads us into the moment of the film.
It's so interesting to think about how that evolution of graffiti writing styles is sort of a version in miniature of the history of modern art.
Mm,
So going from figurative representation where the point is to, do it accurately, to this embrace of abstraction where you're communicating in a pictorial language that is no longer representative, but is, kind of about how much you know of the history of your artistic tradition and communicating to other artists working within that tradition. So there's that parallel. And then Scheme, my favorite kid in the film, clearly, he actually recapitulates this the very first time that we see him on screen. So he first says that he's doing this so that people will see his name and by implication see him. At which point, of course, his mother corrects him and she says, "Nobody knows who you are. They don't care who you are." And he replies, "Well, I don't care if they know who I am. I'm doing this for other graffiti writers. That's who I want to see my name."
yeah. It's such a great moment. And it does convey that this is an insular, they are looking to one another. They want to show off to one another what they can do. And they are clearly not really concerned with what the rest of New York thinks.
Yeah.
But you do have the flip side. So the other side of the film. On one side, the film shows these kids developing their art form and showing off what they can do. On the other hand, you have city leaders who are frustrated with the prevalence of graffiti, most notably Mayor Edward Koch, who is interviewed several
Um,
times in the film.
and who comes across, let's be clear, unsurprisingly, as a colossal piece of work.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. How would you describe him coming across as a piece of work?
I mean, so there's this scene where he is describing, his take on this is how he successfully shamed the MTA into putting vicious dogs at, what are they called? Train lots?
Yeah, train lots where the cars spent, are washed
Where,
and
right,
kept.
where the cars sleep at night, as I think of it. Um, so he describes that
Yards, train yards.
train yards, that's what it is. Thank you.
Yeah.
So there's this scene in the documentary where Ed Koch describes that it was his idea for the MTA to keep mean dogs at train yards. And he disdainfully describes that the MTA replied, "But what if the dog bites someone?" And he says, "Well, I thought that was the point." Ha
Yeah.
ha 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 ha. And that it just goes on with him shaming the MTA, and he says he embarrassed the MTA into finally putting mean dogs at the train yards. And then he says, "Oh, they want to take all the credit for it now that they've done it, but actually it was me." There's this it's the pairing of the viciousness of what he's saying with the supercilious delivery that really does it for me.
Yeah, he comes off as trying to be a little bit showy, thinking that like these remarks are funny. I mean,
Yes.
I don't want to say he's as thoughtless, but there's a certain amount of Trump in him,
Oh yeah,
in the
completely.
like in the joy and cruelty and the showmanship as part of his presence.
And I mean, I don't know a lot about New York municipal politics in New York City during this period of time, but the impression that I got when I lived in New York City was that people thought that Ed Koch was like kind of this fun mayor because of the things that he would say and that they were entertained by it. And so yes, there is this showman-like quality to his appearances in the film.
Well, he's an interesting figure. You know, he was elected in 1978 and was mayor until 1989. So he's brought in to respond to austerity, and he's makes his case as like responding to crime, responding to disorder, getting the city back under control. So a lot of these changes to the character of New York City, what might be nostalgically described as gritty, unnostalgically described as down and out or a broken city. His legacy is seizing control of that and turning it into a city that's ready to be developed into New York as it is now. And as part of that, he targets, quality of life offenses. This film is before I think broken windows policing is officially a term,
Yeah.
but you can hear it in what he's saying. He gives a description of why graffiti is offensive and
So
um
I do want to share with you that, I quickly Googled broken windows theory as we were speaking,
mhm.
and I learned that it was coined by James Q. Wilson and George L. Kelling who were social scientists who worked for conservative think tanks. It was actually coined in an article in 1982.
Okay.
So I did know that it was really under Giuliani and Police Commissioner Bill Bratton that broken windows policing was embraced in New York City, so in the early 90s. But it appears that the term first emerged pretty much contemporaneously with the filming of Style Wars.
Yeah, part of my understanding of why this isn't considered broken windows yet is that the police department was much smaller. So the police department is like more than doubled in size by the time Giuliani takes power. But the like if broken windows policing is targeting littering, targeting small scale crimes, doing stop and frisk, it requires a lot of police on the street to harass everyday residents. And
Mhm.
in 1982, they just didn't have that many police.
Right. And I'm trying to remember because there is a moment where I think it's Ed Koch, someone who's interviewed in the documentary, lists what kind of crimes they're trying to prosecute.
Hmm.
Um, and the other crimes that are listed are not necessarily what we would think of as kind of the grab bag of broken windows type quote unquote crimes. But I can't remember exactly what the list was.
I
So,
have that clip pulled up.
oh, great.
So here we go.
Well, it is one of the quality of life offenses. It's like three-card Monte and pickpocketing and shoplifting and graffiti defacing our public and private walls. They're all in the same area of destroying our lifestyle and making it difficult to enjoy life, and I think has to be responded to. And so I've told you that the response that I think a repeater, three-time repeater should get would be 5 days in jail. Now, obviously, a murderer, if you believe in the death penalty as I do, you want to have the option of executing a murderer. You wouldn't do that to a graffiti writer.
So that is Mayor Koch.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm curious to know what was your reaction when you first heard this clip?
The first time I watched it, the death penalty thing really got me. Like,
Yeah,
of course, we wouldn't give the death penalty
but
to graffiti writers, but it's in the same spectrum of things that I have
yeah.
to talk about.
and and you get the feeling that he's sort of maybe on some level he wishes that he could give them the death penalty. It's pretty disconcerting.
Yeah, I mean, it also, like, I think more seriously, just the linking it with pickpocketing. So you hear that the quality of life offense idea taking shape, and it becomes part of, reestablishing order in the city means getting rid of graffiti, means aggressively prosecuting and targeting graffiti writers and other small nuisances, panhandlers, these sorts of things. Well, I mean, it's just you're seeing the groundwork being laid for a much more aggressive law and order campaign, which is something that takes shape in the late 80s and 90s and, really devastates Black communities and Black kids.
I guess my initial reaction when I got to this part of the documentary was, yes, you can see how this statement and this approach to policing is, of course, it's a predecessor to broken windows policing. And yet, the crimes that he's bringing together really don't match with one another
Right.
to my mind. So to say that the four crimes that he names are pickpocketing, shoplifting, three-card Monte,
Yeah.
and graffiti writing. And you're kind of like, these do not entirely go together, right? Two of them are things that I would be pretty comfortable saying are some sort of theft, right? Pickpocketing, shoplifting, they're kinds of theft. And then you have two things that are just like, there's people who live in the city who act differently than you do, and you have to share space with them, and you might find it annoying.
Yeah.
And so, the logic by which these four activities are grouped together is that all of them make it difficult for people to enjoy life, which I think is such an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah. I mean, I hope this follows on your comment, but one of the one of the common critiques of broken windows theory, I mean, other than that, it's totally false. So policing broken windows does not reduce crime. It, in fact, increases it. And what it mainly does is harass Black and poor communities by sending lots of police into those neighborhoods to target small scale crimes. Eric Garner obviously was killed by broken windows policing because they choked him to death for selling loose cigarettes, which is one of these quality of life offenses. But one of the critiques of Wilson and Kelling is they're pretty explicit about talking about the importance of restoring order. And when they say order in their writing, it's clear that they mean too many black people in public space is disorder. So they
Right.
talk about police telling, black people to stop loitering in certain areas as part of what broken windows policing entails.
Right.
So like the racism of the theory is evident from the very beginning. And
Yes.
and on the flip side, this idea of purity, the idea of cleaning out the space also has a racial dimension to it. So even if you're just talking about making the subway cars clean and pure and this, like the idea of purity is one that is also racialized and is also always that cleanliness is not complete so long as there's racial diversity on the subway.
I think that nails exactly what was striking to me about Mayor Koch's comments. It's so clear from the way that he expresses himself that this is about the reassertion of white order over
Right?
the city. When he says these are the things that make it difficult for people to enjoy life, he's saying these are the things that make it difficult for white people to enjoy life, right?
Yeah.
And, implicitly, that white people can't enjoy their lives if they have to live them near and around Black people.
And I mean, if you look at what New York City has become since, and what I think in some sense he started creating, although certainly Giuliani and Bloomberg played a big part, but the gentrified New York City that is a playground of the ultra rich, much whiter, much less affordable. This is what this was setting the stage for.
Absolutely.
Do we want to talk about the other villain in the film?
Yes, I think that we should.
All right. So there's another villain in the film. This is another graffiti writer. His name is Cap. And basically, what he does is he goes around and he makes quick scribbles over top of other graffiti writers' beautiful murals, destroying them and putting his name on top. And he says that by doing that, he is doing more. He is getting his name out there further and more than the others. He doesn't care about beauty. He just declares about showing his supremacy to the other graffiti writers. And he becomes a big villain to the other graffiti writers who are really understandably upset that their art is being destroyed in this way.
And it's interesting because Cap sees himself as having graffiti skills,
Hmm.
putting them to use in a different way,
Yeah.
right? And of course, the other graffiti writers, they say no, it's because Cap has no skills. This is the only thing that he is capable of doing, and that's why he's acting out in this way.
I think it's interesting. So I show this film to my students. They all hate Cap, just universally, regardless of how they feel about the other graffiti writers. They're like, this is just so offensive that you would do this to
Yeah,
your peers. And yet, like, I also don't like Cap, but I think it's worth reflecting on that he is to some degree doing the same thing that the other graffiti writers are doing, just trying to get his name everywhere. And he succeeds, right? He acquires a lot of fame. Now it's notoriety, but all the other writers know who he is because he's been so successful at putting his name in their face.
right. I thought it was interesting when you were explaining earlier that graffiti really started as just putting names on trains, and that the goal early on was this all city kind of approach where the important thing was to get your name on every train. And it was only later that graffiti acquired its own aesthetic codes and aesthetic language. Could you not see what Cap is doing as just a return to graffiti's authentic roots? And you almost wonder, like, if he had explained himself in those terms, would we think of him differently?
Yeah, he does come across as pretty repulsive, but
Yes,
like,
he
but I
makes a
think
good villain.
an interesting backstory there as well. So there were some of the writers who knew who this guy was, but he wasn't known by most of the graffiti writers at the bench. And Chalfant was asking around because this was popping up. Who is this? And someone made the connection. So said, "Hey, here's he is." And many of the graffiti writers who knew Chalfant well felt betrayed by Cap's inclusion in the film. Why are you giving space to this asshole who's been doing this to us? So
So
it,
interesting.
yeah. And yet, from the perspective we were talking earlier about this being an opera, He's such a key villain for the story to move forward.
I think that really speaks to the difference between what Chalfant understands himself to be doing with the film and what the artists think that they're doing by appearing in it.
Yeah.
They're to make an opera. They're there to communicate about their art and get recognition for their art, which is, quite a different kind of project.
Yeah. So one other thing we wanted to talk about is I think the educational aspect of this. Like one thing that's really interesting to me is watching these kids train each other in the art of graffiti. So you have often shots of them hanging out together, and one will show the other, look, this is how you draw an outline. Now you got to fill it in. This is what's going to happen when you do this. Oh, you're going outside the lines. Look, if you stay between the lines, you're going to be really great at this. You're going to be the next big thing, but you got to like listen to what I'm showing you. And then also gathering, whether it's at the writer's bench or in Chalfant's apartment to look at the photographs, gathering and showing one another sketches and talking about how did this get made. That type of educational work is really interesting to me. There's a book, an old book by Janice Ron called Painting Without Permission that really focuses on how much mutual education takes place in graffiti art circles. But it's really apparent here how much passion they have for teaching one another about what it is that they do.
Yeah. And I think this is just to go back to an earlier point. This to me is one of the places where the sweetness of
Hmm.
the artist really comes through is the utter care with which they treat the younger kids that they're mentoring. You can really see the affection that they have for their proteges.
Yeah, I also think that for me, it provides a strong counter to the narrative put forward by the mayor and others that these are delinquents or that, you know, so one of them, one time the mayor says, well, why don't they just take an art class? And it's like, look at how much they're learning
Hmm.
through this, and also they don't have art classes because they're in the Bronx and you cut all the funding for everything that's there, you know, but
Completely. And so instead of going to an art class, they have an apprenticeship model for making
yeah.
art. What's wrong with that?
Right. So I do think it provides a strong counter to some of these narratives coming from authority figures that they're that they're just reckless
Yeah.
and careless to see that sort of uplift taking place.
I mean, this is, maybe I'm just like in my feelings today, but when you think about how teenage boys today are, their youth culture is like trading really vile memes on social media. You're like, God, how heartwarming they could be, teaching each other how to fill in artwork outlines and go from sketch to large scale piece instead.
Yeah.
Um, I know which behavior I think is more delinquent than the other.
Yeah. I mean, graffiti writers at that time probably had an overblown idea of how much social good was accomplished by graffiti.
And
Like,
an overblown sense of a lot of things because
yeah,
again, they're teenagers.
yeah. I had a book called Bomb the Suburbs by a graffiti artist, William Upski Wimsat, who would say like will writing graffiti will solve racial conflict, right? Because black and white graffiti writers hang out together. And
I
like,
think I remember like trading this book back and forth with people when I was in high school, like this utterly utopian vision of graffiti.
yeah, it was, I mean, all of my friends had to have it. He self-published it and sold it, I think, by hitchhiking from city to city. And so an interesting backstory. And, when you're a teenager, the book is so rebellious and utopian but it's also pretty silly, you know?
But that's one of the fun things about being a teenager, right?
Yeah.
Placing all the importance on the particular thing that you do. Like this will be the thing that changes the world.
Yeah. And then the other thing that we wanted to touch on before moving off the film was the commercialization. I think like one of the more interesting moments in the film is when they have the gallery show and you can see the art moving from not being appreciated to being something that's suddenly worth a lot of money. Whether or not we keep it in, let's watch a segment to give us something to talk about.
For the past 20 years, there really hasn't been anything hot. There have been no movements since pop art. Any retailer, and let's face it, a gallery is indeed a retailer. They're always looking for something hot that they can merchandise and sell to the public.
It's almost as though these pieces were peeled off the train and put onto canvas. So you have the same energy, you have the same coloring, you have the same intensity and the same big piece that you would see on a train.
The real subway graffiti that's done on, on the trains is slowly dying out, and this is taking its place. The lifespan of an average piece today only lasts a few months. This is something that could last a lifetime.
It's so interesting to think about. So yes, you have the part of these gallery shows that is just about people wanting to find the next hot trend in art.
Yeah.
Fair. But there's also this sense of wanting to preserve ephemeral artworks by putting them on canvas, right? And, this is a time period in art where a lot of artwork has been quite ephemeral for a couple of decades, right? So you have, for instance, Yoko Ono's work, or, all of the performance pieces that are videoed, but, not necessarily repeated as performances. And so it's so interesting to ask. I'm going to ask something, but I'm already telling you it's interesting. This is bad tape. You should cut it. Okay, so you've had all of this ephemeral artwork in mainstream art being displayed in and celebrated by and sold by art galleries for a couple of decades at this point. So why is there suddenly this urgency to preserve the ephemeral on canvas? Did anyone ever say to Yoko Ono, you should preserve your ephemeral artwork by painting it on a canvas? I don't think so, right? So the desire to preserve what's ephemeral about graffiti art, is clearly said with good intentions. They want to think of themselves, the gallerists, the buyers at the galleries, they want to think of themselves as giving a new life to a form of art that they're concerned is being repressed out of existence, which might all be true. But at the same time, clearly what's different between the work of the graffiti writers and the work of someone like Yoko Ono is that when the work is on a train, it can't be sold in a gallery or displayed there. And so on some level, what they're looking for is not a defense against ephemerality, but something small enough to put in a gallery and that can be owned by someone in a way that isn't true for a vehicle that belongs to public transit.
Yeah, ownership and status, right? Like I was there when you could get these cheap. They were coming off of the thing. I was in the know. And yeah, if you have one of those first gallery show graffiti pieces today, it's a big status symbol, right? So obviously there's a lot of the buyer's status investment in having seen the value of saving that at the time when it was there.
Right. There's that lady who wants to get in on the ground floor, and she says, anytime that you get in on the ground floor of an art movement, it's a good investment.
Yeah. It's interesting because the flip side, I'm reminded of artists I know from Jordan who are really upset that there are decades where basically nothing is documented, and so there are these art movements that have come and gone, and there's very little trace of them at all. And they were really frustrated with this, but didn't know how to fix it. Like they didn't have a magazine infrastructure or that kind of critical infrastructure to preserve even big projects that have been made.
I mean, it's interesting to hear about artists working in contexts where there are no traces that are preserved of their art and it's lost to the sands of time. That makes me think about the move to the galleries a little bit more generously than I had been previously, because it helps me understand that if the point of graffiti writing is to leave a trace of yourself so that you will be seen by other people, then it's quite logical to want to preserve that trace or extend it into more spaces, right? To move from the train yard to the gallery is not necessarily problematic if you're thinking about it as a tactic that Black and brown youth are using to make their presence in New York City known.
And I mean, the other thing on that note is that it's pretty well known that several of the artists featured in this film were able to build careers
Mhm.
off of graffiti or hip hop. And so the fact that this was a route for them to make something of themselves from limited situation is impressive and
Yeah.
worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reality is that hip hop has been incredibly successful, right? Culturally, financially, in all of the ways. And that's a real point of pride for hip hop artists working in all kinds of genres of creative expression.
Yep.
Um, and so, yeah, I might be anti-commercialization, but we wouldn't have the vibrant hip hop culture that we have today were it not for commercialization.
Right. And that's a great segue because I think the last or second to last thing we want to talk about is what does this look like today and how can we what does the contrast between today and 1982 tell us? And one of the most obvious contrasts is the further commercialization of graffiti and hip hop, that graffiti is now often a selling point for cities. Its mayors frequently encourage graffiti style murals, although there's also the buffing out of other things that they don't want. There are internationally famous graffiti artists who go from city to city to be sponsored to paint murals, often at the behest of property developers who pay them tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on the belief that graffiti will add value to the property or the neighborhood or drive gentrification. So, yeah, I mean, that's just a huge change from what we see in this moment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I feel like I don't have anything intelligent to say about that other than to note, yeah, it's a huge change.
I think that one of the weird things that happened last year or the year before was the 50th anniversary of hip hop celebrations, which were hosted by major East Coast cities. So Philadelphia, New York, DC all had public events celebrating the 50th anniversary of hip hop where they had music parties, speaking events. Philadelphia painted a mural about the history of hip hop, painted by Mural Arts, which originally was the Anti-Graffiti Network, which painted murals in place of graffiti or hired youth
Hmm.
in 1984 to promise not to make graffiti and to instead paint artistic murals, and which now is a powerhouse political organization that hires big name artists like Shepard Fairey to come in and paint brand, enhancing murals for the city. So like that sort of trajectory is
That's so
really
interesting.
strange. I was thinking about, we have these 50th anniversaries in all these cities. Well, who are the mayors that are supporting these celebrations? New York, it's Eric Adams. In Philadelphia, she was elected slightly later, but it's Sherelle Parker. It's Muriel Bowser in DC. It's a weird group of mayors. They're all black but conservative. And Eric Adams obviously has like allied with Trump. So there are these inheritors of the tough on crime, pro development, pro displacement policy making that Koch pioneered in a way.
Mhm.
And yet they are seeing it to their political advantage to celebrate graffiti and hip hop as something that they are also inheriting. And I think that's quite strange.
I think it is strange, but the commercialization of hip hop that we've been tracing can help explain it, right? So I understand that ostensibly what they're doing is celebrating the 50th anniversary of hip hop. But from what you've told me, it sounds like in spirit, what they're actually celebrating is the commercial juggernaut that hip hop has become, and not the rebellious spirit with which it began 50 years ago.
The commercial juggernaut that graffiti has become, and the ability of it to be a piece of cultural capital that valorizes the city and helps sell buildings and tourism.
Right. Do you also have whiplash when you think about where we are now with graffiti valorizing the city versus the Bronx burning in the 70s?
Yeah, I mean it's really a sharp juxtaposition to put them side by side.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to use it, but I did want to read it into the record.
Mhm.
So I thought it was pretty wild that Senator Schumer gave a statement about the hip hop celebration, saying that August 11th is National Hip Hop Celebration Day. The celebration was made official by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer last July, following the 50th anniversary of hip hop. In a speech on the Senate floor, Schumer said, "Hip hop has transcended language, race, age, both geographic and socioeconomic barriers. It is a uniquely American art form that quickly blossomed into a global movement, and we are proud today at this resolution honoring the 50th anniversary of hip hop." On the one hand, like I know that 90% of what politicians do is declare that this is the day of like honoring something because they're easy political wins, but it's really hard to imagine Schumer being an ally to these youth.
Yes.
And
Yes, it is.
and so it again is it whiplash I think is an appropriate dimension. Like
But this is
what is
also,
this signifying? Yeah, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt you. This is also the pattern of white politicians when faced with many innovations that come from Black culture, right?
Right.
So, I mean, I don't know what's happening with it in the current administration, but for many presidential administrations, we have been observing Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Right.
Uh,
Maybe not anymore.
needless to say, yeah, maybe not anymore, but also needless to say that when Dr. King was still with us, it was not a matter of national public religion to celebrate him in this
Right.
way, right? So this is the move that white culture makes with Black American culture. White people in the United States make it very, very difficult for Black Americans to develop their own forms of cultural thriving. Black culture blossoms in this country in a pressure cooker environment. White people are always trying to crush Black culture, and Black culture is always blossoming despite that. And then when Black culture and Black art and Black music go global and capture the imagination of all of the people of the world, then white people want to take credit for it as a uniquely American culture.
That's perfect. So nicely said. Uh, so
So,
I think that is an excellent point to leave it on, actually, reflecting on how far hip hop has come in both good and bad ways, but also the dynamics of oppression and appropriation that are always at work in the United States. I had wanted to say something, I guess, about
you should
how,
still say it. Yeah.
okay. So, I mean, the other thing that occurred to me in these comparisons is just thinking about we were talking about broken windows policing, and then as we're recording, we'll see what happens by the time we produce this. But, the military is in DC, ostensibly fighting crime, and Trump is promising to send federal troops to many other American cities in order to fight crime. And I mean, the evidence of crime in DC is often these small scale things like you walk through, it's dirty, or I heard about shoplifting. So there's a fantasy of urban violence and urban decay that comes from the 1970s, which I don't want to say the Trump right is still rooted in, but that it references and relies on in order to make the case for its advancement of fascism. And you can see that very clearly in what Mayor Koch is doing, even though it's a germ of the tree that Trump would become. Um, and I do think like the idea that graffiti becomes, I mean, graffiti is part of what DC military encampment is attacking. And so, we've come full circle in certain ways.
Yeah, it's 1982 in America all over again.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. That's kind of sad. I liked where you left it better. That was also sad, but it was sad in a different way.
We can decide which want to end the episode with sadness in a major key or in a minor key.
All right. Well, I think are we good? Do you think that's everything we need to cover? All
I
right.
think so.
Well, thanks so much, everyone. We hope you've enjoyed this review of Style Wars with us. It was really nice for us to go back and watch it, or for I think Marielle enjoyed watching it the first time.
Hmm.
Anyway, that's it for today. You've been listening to Bad Art, a podcast about the politics of art in the 21st century. Please continue to listen. So subscribe on whatever platform you use, leave reviews, help other people find us, and send us an email if you have something to say about what we've said. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much, everybody.
We'll hear from you next time. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock.
I'm Marielle Grushko.
Bye.
Bye.